The Age of Exploration. 1. Definition. This refers to that period when European countries began to discover new routes and places. It covers from about 1400 AD to 1750 AD, but the period we will study begins towards the end of the 1400s, when Portugal and Spain were the main countries involved. 2. Reasons for exploration. There were 4 main reasons: new ideas, new trade routes needed, new lands and wealth, and religion. New ideas. The beliefs that many people held before this time included that the earth was flat, that there were monsters in the sea, that people in faraway places had strange shapes, and that the world was smaller than it actually is, with Europe at its centre. The curiosity encouraged in the Renaissance helped the spirit of discovery of the Age of Exploration. New trade routes needed. Italian states such as Florence, Venice and Milan traded with Arab countries to bring spices from the Spice Islands in India and jewels and silk from China. These states became very wealthy as a result. Other countries, especially Spain and Portugal, wanted a share in this wealth, so they tried other routes to these places. The Portuguese opted for exploration around Africa, whereas the Spanish explorers decided to try to get east by sailing west, that is, to circumnavigate the world. Alternative routes became even more important when Muslims who lived in the surrounding areas began to attack travellers on the usual routes such as the Great Silk Road. New lands and wealth. The explorers would claim lands discovered for their countries, who would become wealthy as a result. The explorers themselves would also become rich and famous. Religion. Explorers and their sponsors wanted to defeat Muslims and also wanted to spread Christianity by converting the natives of the countries they discovered. 3. Improvements in ships and navigation that made the exploration possible. Improvements in ships. The caravels with their clinker-built hulls, square and lateen or triangular sails, and castles, that's raised decks, were stronger and more manoeuvrable than the ships that went before them. They could carry more and go more places. Improvements in navigation. Cartographers made better maps, and compasses, astrolabes, quadrants and cross-staffs allowed them to measure latitude. That's how far north and south they were. Speed was measured using log and line and a sand glass. Depth was measured using lead weights on a line. Ships' captains kept careful records of distance travelled, direction, currents and wind speeds, and these logbooks were then used in later voyages. 4. Life on ship. Ship's captains and their first mates were attracted to the voyages of exploration by the chance to share in great wealth. Other crew members shared to a lesser extent. Voyages could be uncertain and dangerous because of sea storms, shipwrecks and attack. The work on board could be hard, especially in bad weather, and the food available to sailors wasn't good. A lack of fresh fruit and vegetables meant a lack of vitamin C, and this could cause scurvy. This was sore gums, vomiting and a lack of energy. A lack of fresh water could cause dehydration, and too much salty meat didn't help either. Hard biscuits, known as hardtack, were unappetizing, but an important part of the diet. Discipline was very harsh, as captains needed to maintain control of frightened crew who were often sailing into the unknown. 5. Portugal's discoveries. A son of the King of Portugal, Henry the Navigator, set up a marine school in the south of Portugal at Sagres. Here they studied map-making, navigation and shipbuilding. As a result, they sailed down to the Canary Islands and took control of the Azores Islands and along the western coast of Africa. Cape Verde, green because of the forestry, was next found, and then along what later became known as the Slave Coast, because this was where slaves were collected to be brought to the Americas. They explored the Ivory Coast, so called later because this was where ivory from elephants was collected, as well as the Gold Coast. Farther south they came to the mouth of the Orange River, and by 1487 Bartholomew Diaz had made it around the Cape of Good Hope. This was originally called the Cape of Storms because of the strong winds at the southern tip of Africa. Only 10 years later, in 1497, Vasco da Gama, 1460 to 1524, with the help of Bartholomew Diaz, who assisted with advice and with ship design, sailed all the way around Africa. From Melinde, on the east coast of Africa, he crossed the Indian Ocean to India with the help of a local pilot, and landed in Calicut. He had 2 carracks and a caravel, called São Gabriel, São Rafael, the Berrio, also called São Miguel, after the Christian belief in God's archangels. Da Gama's success began a long involvement by Portugal with trade from India and Asia, as well as the Spice Islands that they reached later, as well as considerable exploitation of the African coastline that they had discovered. Spain's discoveries. 6. Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506. Columbus was born in Genoa, in Italy, but sailed for Spain, when he succeeded in convincing King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to sponsor his journey west to get to the Spice Islands. Believing that the distance was about 4,500 kilometres, he hoped to reach either China or Japan. He set sail from Palos in the south of Spain on board his flagship, the Santa Maria, a carrack, while the Pinzon brothers captained the 2 caravels, the Nina and the Pinta. They sailed south down to the Canary Islands, where they landed on Gran Canaria. From there, they sailed west across the Atlantic and on October the 12th, 1492, landed on what he called San Salvador, in the Bahamas. From there, they explored Cuba and Hispaniola, later called Haiti. On Christmas Day, the Santa Maria sank, and he used the salvaged timber to help build a fort called Navidad, or Nativity, for about 40 of his crew, whom he left behind when he set sail for Portugal in January. They were later killed by natives. He arrived back to Lisbon on March the 4th, 1493, and then on to Palos. To the king and queen he brought back some gold, pineapples and parrots, previously unheard of, and 6 natives, whom he called Indians, in the mistaken belief that they were from Asia. Columbus made 3 more voyages to what is now called the West Indies, and also down to parts of what we now know as South America, but he never reached his original destination. He treated the natives badly in his search for gold, and at one stage was arrested and brought back to Spain. It is said that he died disappointed. It was the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, 1454 to 1512, who discovered that Columbus had in fact discovered 2 new continents, North and South America. They were later called after Amerigo. Spain and Portugal were now in dispute over who was entitled to exploit the newly discovered lands and routes. To avoid a war, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. An imaginary line was drawn down the Atlantic Ocean, with everything to the west being Spain's and everything to the east belonging to Portugal. 7. Ferdinand Magellan, 1480 to 1521. Magellan was from Portugal but sailed for the Spanish after a dispute with Portugal. He persuaded King Charles V of Spain to finance a voyage that would get him to the Spice Islands, sailing west in the Spanish half of the world. He intended to sail around South America to the ocean he believed to be on the other side, and then across this ocean to the Spice Islands. He set sail from Seville in September 1519, with a fleet of 5 ships and a crew of 270. The ships were Trinidad, a caravel that was later captured and wrecked; San Antonio, that deserted and returned home before Magellan got to the southern tip of South America; the Concepcion; and Santiago, that was shipwrecked; and the Victoria. They sailed south to the Canary Islands, down past Cape Verde, then west across the Atlantic, where he spent time sailing down the coast of South America. They spent the winter in Port St. Julian, in what is now Argentina. Months later they found El Paso, the pass from one ocean into the other, for which Magellan had been searching. In November 1520 they sailed around the southern tip of the continent, now called the Straits of Magellan in his honour. Then they sailed northwest towards where he believed the Spice Islands to be. Many of the crew died in this crossing from scurvy due to the lack of food. The seas were not nearly as rough in this section of the voyage, and they named the ocean the Mare Pacifico, the peaceful sea, called the Pacific Ocean in English. They reached the Philippines in March 1521, and then south to the Spice Islands. Magellan became involved in a local dispute between tribes and was killed in battle in April. Del Cano captained the only remaining ship, the Victoria, that made it back to Seville in September 1522 along with only 17 men, but with sufficient spices to pay for the entire voyage and leave some profit. The world had been successfully circumnavigated. However, the voyage also proved that the Spice Islands were in the Portuguese half of the world, so Spain now concentrated on South America, leaving Africa and the Spice Islands to Portugal. 8. The Conquistadors, the Conquerors. Cortes conquers the Aztecs. From the island of Cuba, Hernando Cortes, with 500 soldiers, sailed to the mainland and, with the help of local tribes, set about taking over what is now known as Mexico from the Aztecs for Spain. Believing them to be their returning gods, the Aztecs greeted Cortes and his men, as did their emperor Montezuma. In 1519, with an army of 100,000, mainly from the other tribes, Cortes defeated the Aztecs and razed their capital city, Tenochtitlan, where he later built Mexico City. The defeated Aztecs and many other native tribes were sent to work in the gold and silver mines and the plantation estates later set up by settlers from Portugal. Pizarro conquers the Incas. From Panama, Francisco Pizarro set out with about 180 soldiers for the Incas in Peru. Pizarro captured the Inca leader, Atahualpa, and killed him once he received a ransom in gold for his release. The Spanish then went south and attacked the capital city Cuzco in the Andes Mountains. With the Incas defeated, the gold and silver mines worked by the locals as slaves and later by slaves brought from Africa became a source of great wealth for Spain. Over the next century, both civilizations were wiped out due to battles outlined above, death from European diseases, against which they had no immunity, and the harsh lives lived in slavery, working in the mines and on plantation estates. A similar fate was met by the natives in Brazil at the hands of the Portuguese. 9. The effect of the Age of Exploration on the countries discovered. Extinction of civilizations. As described earlier, the Aztecs of Mexico and the Incas of Peru were wiped out by war, disease, and the harsh lives spent as slaves, mining gold and silver, or working on the plantation estates, farming sugar and cotton. These and other natives of the Americas, north and south, also lost their land and became slaves, or at best tenants. Loss of culture. Eventually, European languages, laws, art and religion replaced native ones. European Christianity replaced native beliefs as Spain and Portugal spread Catholicism. In later times, the Dutch and British brought Protestantism. The native languages also went into decline as Spain, Portugal, Britain and France took hold of North and South America. Slavery. Africans were forcibly taken by European and African slave traders and sold to work in the Americas on the sugar, coffee and cotton plantations and in the mines. They worked for no pay in harsh working conditions. Slavery wasn't abolished until the 19th century, by which time it had done much harm. And finally, 10. The effect of the Age of Exploration on Europe. The geography of the world. The world turned out to be much bigger than originally believed. New countries were discovered, better maps were made, and the strange ideas that Europeans had about the rest of the world were changed. The growth of empires. Spain, Portugal, and later Holland, Britain and France became rich and powerful nations due to the wealth they earned from the countries they colonised, the minerals they exploited, and the trade they did as a result. These countries also went to war as they competed for world domination. New foods and products. So-called Old World plants such as wheat, cotton, sugar and coffee grew even better in the Americas, and they were widely grown on the plantations and exported to Europe. New World plants such as potatoes and corn, cocoa for chocolate, peppers and pineapples were also exported. Turkeys also came from the New